All right, guys, welcome back. So, we're looking at poetry again. Now, I want you guys to recognize that when it comes to poetry, I love this particular subject. I love poetry in so many ways. One of the most important things, though, is that poetry is not something that everybody loves, and that's okay. You don't have to. Um, but it is something which you're expected to understand. Poetry is a type of expression, it's a type of writing that really gets to the heart of things. And it uses a lot of different techniques and it uses a lot of different methods to try and do that. Now, poetry has been passed down for centuries, and some of the best poetry deals with some of the most complex issues of human understanding. The complexity of love, questions about death, uh, loss, fear, loneliness. These all are big issue things which people want to know others share. People want to know that they're not alone in their emotional uh, reaction to events in their lives. And poetry is one of the ways that people have to effectively respond. Now, whether it is uh, Dylan Thomas or whether it is Dr. Seuss, it doesn't matter who the poet is. Someone out there can connect to that writer. Elizabeth Barrett Browning has a great poem about love. Uh, Robert Service has brilliant poetry about the great outdoors. He also has funny poems. Robert Browning, Robert Frost, all of these people have phenomenal ideas that they've expressed in their writing. Now, what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be going back to some of the terms, and then we're going to be moving on through some of the forms in poetry. So you should all have this poetry PowerPoint on the Google Classroom. I encourage you to access it while we go through this so that you're looking at it too. Anyhow, we are going to come down to the types of poetry. There's narrative and descriptive poems, and abstract and shaped poetry. Narrative poems tell a story. You should already have had this. Uh, Descriptive poems describe something, and abstract poems don't necessarily fall within confines of other styles. They may be in shapes and other forms. Okay, now poetic devices. This is really where we're going to start talking, and this is a list of poetic devices or literary techniques. Now, alliteration, that's the repetition of the initial consonant sound in a series of words. Now, if you don't know what a consonant is, it is the letters that are not vowels. So the B's or the P's or the T's or the C's or the S's. Anytime you have a repetition of that initial consonant sound in a series of words, that's alliteration. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers is a good example, although it's an overused example. And it doesn't have to have lots of them. It can be two or three in a series of lines. Allusion is a reference to some other historical or fictional narrative event or person. Do not mistake allusion with illusion, which is a figmentary image, okay, or something that isn't really there. Hyperbole, not hyperbole. Hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration. A metaphor is a direct comparison between two physically dissimilar things. He was a rock, as opposed to the simile, which is down here, which is using like or as to compare two things. He was as strong as a bull, using that as phrase. Onomatopoeia, a word which imitates a specific sound. Boom is a good example. Personification, the giving of human characteristics to non-living or non-human things. The tree clawed at the window. The car shrieked as it went around the corner. It doesn't really do that, but you need to recognize that it's a personification of a non-living thing. Oxymoron, this is like jumbo shrimp, comparing two opposite words, placing them together, cramming two opposite words together to try and create a mental contrast. So we've gone through this. We've talked about this in the past. This is not anything new. This is not anything unfamiliar. Now we're going to move on to some of the poetic forms. Some of this stuff might be new. Okay. Now, poetic forms are the styles in which poetry is constructed, and there are a number of forms of poetry. The most common are the sonnet, ballad, free verse, the ode, the elegy, haiku, blank verse, and concrete. Now, what I need you guys to realize is that different types of poetry are written for different purposes. And sometimes the more complex the poetry, the more complex the purpose, or the more structured the society in which the poetry was written. Now, different poets have different goals. In many cases, the choice of poetry in poetic form is based on social preferences. Specific types of poetry have been more popular in certain time periods than other forms. In more recent history, the structure or form of a poem is chosen to reflect the values of the poet. Highly structured poetry, for example, demonstrates a closer attention to an ideal than free verse, which focuses on the ability to express without limits or constraint. I want you to think about that in terms of modern society. Modern society is about freedom. It's about lack of social constraint. It's about lack of um, levels or hierarchy within society. And so the poetry of the present reflects that freedom. It reflects that lack of rules, and therefore the poetry lacks rules. In the same way, if you go back 150, 200 years, you're moving into a society that was much more rigid. If you go back 500 years, it was even more rigidly constructed. If you go back thousands of years, you're going to see even more differences in the structuring and formatting of poetry. Now, looking forward, rhyme scheme. When we talk about rhyme scheme, we're talking about how words in lines sound similar to words in other lines. Rhyme is a really easy concept to understand, but rhyme scheme is how you match those rhyming words. So it's usually abbreviated with an AB notation. For example, a poem where every two lines rhyme would be noted as AABB. That is called couplets. A poem where every other line rhymes is A, B, A, B. That is called alternating rhyme. A poem where the first and last lines rhyme, as do the middle two, would be A, B, B, A, etc. If the rhyme scheme is more complex, additional letters may be employed, ABC, ABC, that kind of stuff. So when you're looking at a poem, just to get yourself an understanding of what type of style the poet might be using, see if there is end line rhyme or end end stop rhyme. Meter. Meter is the way the poem is read, the manner in which stress is placed in specific places. Not all poems use specific meter, but many do. Understanding the meter in a poem is very important. There are 5 types of meter, and the grouping of stressed and unstressed syllables is called a poetic foot. So, English works in a very specific way. You might have noticed by the way I speak that we tend to have this kind of balance in our words. That's meter. Okay, it's the beat to the music, or it's the beat to the language. It's a meter. Now, there are different ways it can be notated, and there are 5 different ways in English that we note it. They are iambic. This is pretty much how English is spoken. We have an unstressed, stressed format. We start with an unstressed word. So English is usually unstressed, stressed in its structure. If it's got more than 2 or 3 syllables, it's often anapestic, which is unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So you're going to notice this sort of little half circle thingy here. That's the unstressed, and this slash is the stressed syllable. Now, you're not going to need to know that too much this year. But in the future, you may be required to understand and be able to express an understanding of metric structure of this meter format. So be aware of it, learn it. I'm going to quiz you on it. So be aware of that. Iambic, most common. Trochaic, that's where you have the stressed first and then the unstressed. It's less common. It usually creates a stilted or jerking structure of meter. Anapestic, this kind of works like iambic. except it has it's for longer structures. Dactylic, opposite of anapestic, it's very rarely seen. You very rarely ever see dactylic. And spondaic, this is a double stress. This is exclusively for emphasis. Okay, it's not used for anything else. Metric feet. So poetic feet are the individual collections of stressed and unstressed syllables. These are united into specific groupings. They're labeled by number of feet per line and type of meter structure. So, long story short, an unstressed, stressed meter, which is iambic, if you have 5 of those in a line, that becomes iambic pentameter. So it has 5 more iambic structures. Pentameter. I know it's complex. We'll talk about it in greater depth later. So why do we need to know that? We need to know that because the sonnet in particular has both rhyme scheme and metric structure. It has both aspects to that. So you need to be aware that the sonnet, this form of poetry, uses those 2 techniques, meter and rhyme. Now, there are 2 types of sonnet. There is the Shakespearean or Elizabethan sonnet, and there's the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. Both of these 2 sonnets use meter, they use rhyme. They are always 14 lines long. Okay? It has always got a specific meter, and it always has a specific rhyme scheme. So looking at the different types of rhyme scheme, the Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet is called the Shakespearean sonnet because Shakespeare was the one that really used it a lot. William Shakespeare was a poet and playwright in the late part of 1500s and the early part of the 1600s. He's one of the most famous and well-known writers in English history, and so it's worth knowing that he primarily wrote poems. He primarily wrote sonnets. His plays, which are what he's best known for, are still performed. 500 years later, they're still performed. Shakespeare in the Park, on Broadway, in theaters around the world. Shakespeare's still performed. Movies are still made about his stuff, but we're talking about poetry right now, and he often wrote in sonnets. Now, there were always 14 lines, and it was always iambic pentameter. So again, that's that unstressed, stressed structure, and there were always 5 of those feet in every line of verse for 14 lines. And it always had a specific rhyme scheme. It was an alternating rhyme scheme with a rhyming couplet at the end. So it was A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. When you have 4 lines like that, it's called a quatrain. So, or a stanza. But this quatrain or stanza usually is a stand-alone idea in Shakespearean sonnets. And the rhyming couplet sums up the poem. It's kind of like an essay in poetic form, with your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. So, kind of cool, interesting to know about. And then you've got your Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. This was made famous by an Italian poet by the name of, Petrarch. Again, always 14 lines, always in iambic pentameter, but it has a different structure. It has a different format. It comes in 2 stanzas instead of the 4 stanzas of the Shakespearean. And one stanza is an octave. It has 8 lines. And one stanza is a sestet. It has 6 lines. The rhyme scheme is always A, B, B, A for the octave, and C, D, E for the sestet. The last 2 lines never rhyme. So if you see a rhyming couplet at the end of a 14-line poem, you can pretty much be guaranteed that it is a Shakespearean sonnet. And if you don't see a rhyming couplet at the end of a 14-line poem, you can pretty much be assured that it is going to be an Italian sonnet. Just one of those things. Okay, next one, the ballad. It's usually a long narrative poem. It adheres to a rhyme scheme, often uses meter, but it doesn't have to. It just usually does. Sometimes the ballad has a chorus or a refrain. Originally created as a strong song structure, the ballad is one of the oldest poetic forms. These are the longer story poems. People told stories in poetic form. They would often sing these. You could anticipate hearing love ballads or great ballads in inns and taverns in the very olden days. It was one of the high forms of entertainment. The haiku. This is a Japanese structure. It is very Japanese. It's primarily about the natural world. It's meditative, it's descriptive, and it is always 3 lines long. It has a specific syllable count. So it doesn't use metric structure, it uses syllable. And that's the big difference between an English poem and a Japanese poem, is that they use a specific way of doing things as well. So it's always 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. Now, the title often gives additional insight into the poem, but it doesn't have to have a title. It's just 3 lines, usually meditative and almost always about the natural world. Okay. Free verse. This is kind of a newish type of writing. It's cropped up in the last 100 or so years. It doesn't have rules. You can do pretty much whatever you want with it. It can use rhyme. It doesn't have to. It can have meter in parts of it, but not all of it. It's pretty much whatever you want it to be. And this is why it is so popular in the modern time period, because with a limit of rules and a society that is much freer and less constrained by rules, the poetry reflects that. And so if you look at the music that you listen to, yes, you might have a refrain, you might have a chorus, you might have those sorts of things, but the writing itself often doesn't rhyme. It often doesn't stick to specific rules, and that's free verse poetry. The ode, very old style of poem. It's written for an occasion or to a particular subject, very dignified. Classically, it consists of 3 parts: the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. We can talk about that in greater depth, but more than anything else, I just want you to recognize that the ode is an old style of poetry with 3 parts: the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. Learn that, and it might be a test question. The elegy, which is different from a eulogy. Elegy. An elegy is a reflective, mournful poem, usually written about the loss of someone. The elegy may be written about something mysterious to the author. Okay. Blank verse. Kind of like free verse, except it's got meter. So it has specific meter, but no specific rhyme. Usually iambic pentameter is employed in the writing of blank verse. Blank verse can be either narrative or descriptive in nature. Shakespeare, in his plays, actually used a lot of blank verse poetry, which is kind of cool to know that a play is written almost exclusively with poetry. Concrete or shape poetry. This is where you have poems that are constructed in the form of something. Like a poem about a flower might be in the shape of a flower. And then I want you guys to really carefully read through the 5-step analysis process. We're going to be going through this with poetry, and I want you guys to be aware of how to do it. So reread, reread, reread. It's going to be one of the key components to all the steps of the 5-step analysis. The first thing, of course, is read the poem, then reread the poem. A second reading improves the chance of understanding the poem's basic intent. Second, reread it. Then circle the verbs. Knowing the verbs and tenses lets the reader know when and what is happening. If you don't know what a verb is, go back to our grammar session earlier in the year. Read again and then underline descriptors. These are adjectives and adverbs. Again, if you're not sure what these are, go back to our grammar lesson earlier on the Google Classroom stream. Knowing the descriptors helps the reader visualize what is being described. It improves our retention of material. Reread and note poetic devices. This is where learning the poetic devices comes in really handy. Recognizing what the author is using to craft his poem helps us to understand the specifics of the poem and its artistic merits. This is where we start to reflect and appreciate the writing as writing. And then finally, write a response. It should be 2/3 of the page. Every poem you read, you should respond to, particularly for this course. You should have some kind of visceral reaction. You should have some kind of response. You need to be able to say, I liked this poem because, or I didn't like this poem because. Now, a personal response should summarize the poem, so not a long summary, but provide context for the response in 1 or 2 sentences, as well as relate the poem to something relevant to the self. A poem about a creek, for example, might result in a description of a camping trip it reminded you of. This is a response to it. It's not just saying, I like the poem. Why did you like the poem? I like the poem because it was good. No, not good enough. I like the poem because it was good and it used stuff. No, give me something deep. I appreciated this poem because uh, the expression that Robert Service had about the mountains really connected with me. I love being in the outdoors and I love being in the mountains. And it reminded me of all of the camping trips I do and the creeks. And when he uses the line, valleys the moon could roll in, it really creates a visual awareness for me that makes me appreciate the great outdoors. Something like that is a personal response. Bear that in mind. Okay. I'm going to cut this one short so that you guys actually have a chance to watch it. Take care, and I will add some poetry in the next little while for you guys to read using the 5-step analysis. There's going to be a quiz on this material. Good luck.